There is a paddock on the edge of Windsor Great Park in the Berkshire village of Sunninghill, where for 29 years a 12-bedroom mansion stood. You can walk past it on the public road that runs along its southern boundary. You will see grass. You will see the line of a former drive. You will see, if you know where to look, a rectangular depression in the ground that the local council records describe as a preserved swimming pool foundation. There is nothing else. No building, no ruin, no marker. The house that stood there cost the British taxpayer £5 million to build in 1986. It was a wedding gift from Queen Elizabeth II to her second son. It was demolished 30 years later in a silent operation that the Crown Estate has never formally explained. The land has been empty ever since. The site has a name. The name is Sunninghill Park. This is the story of a house that the British press could not stop mocking while it stood, and could not stop investigating after it fell. It is the story of a wedding, a marriage, a set of photographs taken on a French beach in August 1992, a fire, a divorce, an empty decade, a £15 million sale to a Kazakhstani businessman, and a demolition that left only a rectangle of concrete in the earth. It is the story of how a Tudorbethan mansion, ridiculed in its own time as Disneyland for the Yorks and South York and the Tesco-style mansion, became, in its absence, the most carefully erased royal property in modern British history. And it is the story of £15 million in cash, arriving in 2 tranches through Switzerland in the summer of 2007, paid by a Bermuda-registered company called Property Holding Ltd, the source of which the Sunday Times Insight team spent 6 years trying to trace, and never did. The land at Sunninghill has been royal adjacent for 4 centuries. The first Sunninghill Park House was a 17th century building, originally owned by the Spencer family, the Earls of Sunderland, whose connections to the court of Charles II placed them within the orbit of royal favour. The house passed through several hands across the 18th and 19th centuries, was extended, was modernised, and by the 20th century had become a moderately distinguished country house of red brick and stone dressings set in 300 acres of parkland that abutted at its eastern boundary the great forest that surrounds Windsor Castle. In 1942, with the Second World War transforming every large house in southern England into something other than what it had been, Sunninghill Park was requisitioned by the United States Army Air Force as a barracks for personnel attached to the airfields of Berkshire and Surrey. American servicemen slept in the bedrooms where 18th century courtiers had taken tea. The kitchens fed 200 men at a sitting. The stable block became a motor pool. The grounds, which had been grazed by deer for 2 centuries, were churned by jeeps and supply lorries. The land registry filings of the period described the property as in active military use for the duration of hostilities. Local memoirs from the village of Sunninghill, gathered by a parish history project in the 1970s, recall American voices in the lanes, jeeps parked along the verges, and the constant traffic between the requisitioned house and the airfields at White Waltham and Smith's Lawn. The house, which had been a private residence since the 17th century, was now, for the first time in its long history, a building of strategic importance to a war effort. And then, on a quiet night in 1947, 2 years after the war ended and the Americans had gone, the original Sunninghill Park House burned to the ground. The fire was reported in the local papers as accidental, attributed to a fault in the wartime electrical wiring that had been installed in haste and never properly removed. The roof collapsed within an hour. By dawn, the 17th century house was a shell of blackened brick. The fire crews from Ascot and Bracknell who attended the scene reported that the speed of the spread had been extraordinary, even by the standards of period electrical fires. The interior, which had been heavily modified by the wartime conversion, contained quantities of plywood partitioning, surplus electrical cabling, and stored materials that had never been removed when the American occupation ended. The fire consumed the lot. For nearly 40 years the site lay empty. The land was held by the Crown Estate. The foundations of the old house were cleared by 1949. The grounds were maintained as agricultural pasture. There was talk, periodically, of building a new house on the site, but the projects never advanced. A 1962 internal Crown Estate memorandum referenced in subsequent Freedom of Information disclosures, considered and rejected a proposal to develop the site as a small training college. A 1971 proposal to lease the land for a conference centre was likewise rejected. Sunninghill Park became one of those royal properties that exists on paper, generating modest rental income from a tenant farmer, waiting for a purpose that would not become clear until the engagement in March 1986 of the Queen's second son to Sarah Ferguson. The purpose arrived in 1986. On 23rd July 1986 at Westminster Abbey, Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, and the second son of Queen Elizabeth II married Sarah Ferguson, the daughter of Major Ronald Ferguson, polo manager to the Prince of Wales. The wedding was televised. 500 million viewers worldwide watched the ceremony. The bride wore an ivory silk dress designed by Lindka Sierak. The groom wore the dress uniform of a Royal Navy lieutenant. The atmosphere in the press accounts of the day was one of relief and warmth. After the difficult Charles and Diana wedding of 1981, whose strain was already visible to attentive observers, the Andrew and Sarah wedding seemed to be everything a royal marriage was supposed to be. Two young people who clearly liked each other, a bride with a sense of humour, a groom whose military service in the Falklands had earned him genuine public respect. The Queen, it was reported, was visibly delighted. The wedding gift was Sunninghill Park, not the old house, which had been gone for nearly 40 years. A new house, a house to be built on the site, designed for the new Duke and Duchess of York, paid for by the Queen from the Privy Purse at a cost of approximately £5 million, which in 2026 currency is something over £15 million. The architect chosen for the commission was Sir William Whitfield, then 66 years old, a respected establishment architect who had worked on Lambeth Palace and the Department of Health and Social Security building in Whitehall. Whitfield was not a flamboyant choice. He was a safe pair of hands. What Whitfield delivered was not safe. It was, depending on whom you asked, either a brave attempt to revive the Tudor manor house for the late 20th century, or one of the most universally mocked pieces of domestic architecture commissioned by the British royal family in the modern era. The house had 12 bedrooms. It had an indoor swimming pool. It had separate staff quarters for 14 members of household staff. It had a galleried entrance hall, mullioned windows in lead, gabled roofs, decorative chimneys in moulded brick, and oak panelling in the principal reception room. The style was described in the official press release as Tudorbethan revival, a term that combined Tudor and Elizabethan and was meant to evoke continuity with England's deepest architectural traditions. The British press took one look at the photographs released in late 1986 and decided that what Whitfield had actually designed was a suburban executive home of unusual size. The mockery began within weeks of the building being topped out. Country Life magazine, in a 1987 column, called it a Tudor pastiche, so determined to look 16th century that it forgot how to look like a house. The Daily Telegraph nicknamed it South York, a reference both to the suburban developments of southern England and to the popular American soap opera Dallas, in which the wealthy and theatrical Ewing family lived in a similarly grand and similarly mocked house called Southwark. Private Eye christened it Disneyland for the Yorks. The Sunday Times architectural critic compared it to a Tesco superstore that had got above itself, which was reduced in the popular shorthand to the Tesco-style mansion, a phrase that followed Sunninghill Park for the entire 29 years of its existence. The Yorks moved in fully in 1990. Their first daughter, Beatrice, had been born in August 1988, and their second daughter, Eugenie, in March 1990. By the time the family was in residence, the marriage was already showing signs of strain that the press had begun to notice. Andrew's naval career kept him away from home for long stretches. Sarah, by her own subsequent accounts, found the constraints of royal life suffocating. The pair had married young. The Tudorbethan mansion they had been given was, in its sheer scale and its insistent decorative gestures, a setting that demanded a kind of life that neither of them was naturally inclined to lead. Penny Junor, in her 2005 study of the royal household called The Firm, observed that the gift of Sunninghill Park had carried with it a particular kind of pressure that was rarely articulated in the press at the time. The Queen, Juna wrote, had chosen to commission a new building rather than to bestow an existing royal residence, and the choice had imposed on the new Duke and Duchess a requirement to make the house, in some sense, theirs. The Tudorbethan style, the press release describing the project as a revival of England's deepest architectural traditions, the very public nature of the commission, all meant that the Yorks were expected to inhabit the building as the institution had imagined them inhabiting it. They were expected to host. They were expected to entertain. They were expected to fill the 12 bedrooms with the right guests on the right weekends. Sarah, who had grown up in a different kind of country house culture, found the role uncomfortable from the outset. Andrew, whose temperament had been shaped by naval service and by the relatively informal codes of officer life at sea, was likewise less at home in the Tudorbethan reception rooms than the Queen's Commission had assumed he would be. The press, having decided in 1987 that the house was a joke, kept finding reasons to renew the joke across the late 1980s. Every photograph released for an official occasion was scrutinized for evidence of suburban taste. The galleried entrance hall was described in a 1989 Sunday Times feature as the foyer of a Midlands chain hotel. The lead in the mullioned windows was described in a 1990 Telegraph piece as having been ordered from a catalogue. The moulded brick chimneys were compared, by a private eye columnist of the period, to the kind of decorative feature you might find on a turkey processing plant designed to look like a barn. The mockery was relentless and, for the household at Sunninghill, demoralising. Brian Smith, the head butler, told a single Sunday newspaper years later that the staff had stopped reading the press cuttings within the first 18 months because there was no point. And then came August 1992. On 8th August 1992, at a villa in Saint-Tropez on the French Riviera, owned by an American financial advisor named John Bryan, a photographer working with a telephoto lens from a nearby hillside took a series of photographs of Sarah, Duchess of York, sunbathing topless beside the villa's pool. In several of the photographs, Brian, who had become close to the Duchess in the months following her separation from Andrew, was seen kissing her feet. In one photograph, he appeared to be sucking her toes. The Duchess's two daughters, aged 4 and 2, were present at the villa. Though not in the photographs, the photographer sold the images to the Daily Mirror. The Mirror published them on 20th August 1992 across the front page and most of the inside pages in what remains one of the most consequential single editions of any British tabloid newspaper. The Duchess of York was at Sunninghill Park when the photographs were published. So was the Queen. The royal family was in residence at Balmoral for the traditional summer holiday, and Sarah had travelled to join them. The breakfast at which the Queen first saw the Mirror's front page has become a fixed point in royal memoir literature. Sarah, in her 1996 autobiography, described the silence at the table as the longest of her life. The toe-sucking photographs ended the marriage. The separation between Andrew and Sarah had in fact been formally announced 5 months earlier, on 19th of March 1992, but the announcement had been carefully managed as a friendly parting, a trial period, a recognition that the pressures of royal life had created stresses that needed space to resolve. The August photographs removed any possibility of resolution. They made Sarah, in the language of the tabloid press of the period, a figure of ridicule. They made the Yorks' marriage a national joke, and they made Sunninghill Park, the Tudorbethan mansion that had been their wedding gift only 6 years earlier, a setting for a slow public unwinding that took until the end of 1995 to complete. The decree absolute was issued on 30th of May 1996. By the terms of the divorce settlement, Sarah was required to leave Sunninghill Park. She did so in the summer of 1996. Andrew retained sole use of the house. The arrangement, by any standard, was unusual. Sarah did not move far. She took a house in Surrey within a short drive of Sunninghill, and for the next decade she returned to the mansion frequently, dining there with Andrew and the children, staying overnight when the daughters were home from school, and maintaining what observers across the royal household described as a degree of post-divorce cohabitation that had no precedent in modern royal practice. The Yorks were divorced, They lived, in many practical respects, as though they were not. In between, in 1994, a fire broke out in the south wing of Sunninghill. The cause was reported as electrical. The damage was extensive enough to render part of the house uninhabitable for nearly a year while restoration proceeded. The fire received modest press attention at the time. In retrospect, in the light of what happened to the building 2 decades later, the 1994 fire reads as the first sign that Sunninghill Park, the house that had been a wedding gift in 1986, was beginning the long process of disappearing. The 1994 fire was reported in the local Berkshire press as having begun in a service corridor at the rear of the south wing. The fire brigade attended within 12 minutes of the alarm. The principal reception rooms were not damaged. The galleried entrance hall was not damaged. The bedrooms in the affected wing were rendered uninhabitable. Restoration work continued through the autumn and winter of 1994 and into the spring of 1995. The contractors were drawn from the same firms that had handled the original 1986 build. Costs were not publicly disclosed. The household, during the restoration period, operated on a reduced footing, with several staff temporarily reassigned to other royal residences. The fire, in the context of the year that followed it, which contained the December 1995 announcement of the divorce, came to be seen by certain household figures as a kind of accelerant to a process that was already underway. The Tudorbethan mansion, the wedding gift of 9 years earlier, was already, by the autumn of 1994, beginning to feel less like a home and more like a building waiting to be vacated. The decade between the 1996 divorce and the 2004 decision to sell is the quietest decade in the building's 29-year life. Andrew, in his role as a working royal and as a Royal Navy officer until his 2001 retirement from active service, was frequently absent. The princesses, by the late 1990s, were boarding at Coworth Park School and subsequently at St George's School, Ascot, returning to Sunninghill for weekends and school holidays. Sarah's continued presence at the mansion, dining with the family, hosting on certain occasions, sleeping over in what the household referred to internally as the East Suite, gave the building an emotional continuity that its formal ownership did not reflect. The press, which had relentlessly covered the marriage and the divorce, lost interest in the daily life at Sunninghill in the years that followed. There were occasional features. There were occasional photographs of Andrew leaving the gates in his car. The press attention that had defined the building's first decade had, by the end of the second, largely moved on. Tonight, this story will lead, by stages, to the question that has hung over Sunninghill Park since the summer of 2007. The question that the Sunday Times Insight team spent 6 years investigating without resolution. The question that BBC Panorama raised in 2010 and that Andrew Loney examined in his 2022 book entitled The Question of Why a Kazakhstani Businessman named Timur Kulibayev, son-in-law of the President of Kazakhstan, paid £15 million in cash for a Tudorbethan mansion that had been on the market at £12 million, and what the £3 million premium was actually for. That is the question that, when answered, will lead by stages to the demolition of the house in 2015 and 2016, and to the empty paddock that is there today. We will arrive at that question. We will examine what is known. We will examine what is not known. We will examine the documents in the land registry, the press accounts of the period, the parliamentary questions that were tabled and not answered, and the published reporting of the Sunday Times Insight team. We will name the participants. We will date the acts. And we will, in the end, walk with you to the edge of the paddock at Sunninghill, where the rectangular depression in the earth is the only physical evidence that the mansion ever existed. By 2004, Prince Andrew had begun the process of selling Sunninghill Park. The reasons given in the press at the time were practical. The Duke of York had reduced his royal duties following his retirement from active naval service in 2001. His role as the United Kingdom's special representative for international trade and investment, a position he had taken up in 2001 and held until 2011, required him to travel extensively. Sunninghill Park, with its 12 bedrooms and 14-member household staff, was disproportionate to his actual living requirements. The Crown Estate, which held the freehold of the land, had agreed in 1986 that the house, paid for by the Queen, would remain Andrew's to dispose of as he chose. He chose to sell. The house was placed on the market in 2004 at an asking price of £12 million. The marketing was discreet. The estate agent was Knight Frank. The buyer's agents who viewed the property in 2004 and 2005 were drawn from a relatively narrow pool of high net worth international purchasers, the Russian and Middle Eastern and East Asian buyers who had begun in the early 2000s to acquire trophy properties in the home counties. The house did not sell quickly. It sat on the market for 3 years. The Tudorbethan style, the press mockery that had attached to it since 1987, the awkwardness of its association with the Yorks' divorce, all weighed against it. In the summer of 2007, a buyer emerged. The name on the land registry record of the sale, completed on 12th of July 2007, was Property Holding Ltd, a company registered in Bermuda. The principal beneficial owner of Property Holding Ltd, as established by subsequent journalistic investigation, was Timur Kulibayev, born 1966, Kazakhstani businessman, vice chairman of the Kazakh state energy company Kazmunaygas, husband of Dinara Kulibayeva, who was at the time of the purchase among the richest women in Asia, and son-in-law of Nursultan Nazarbayev, the president of Kazakhstan, who had held that office continuously since 1990 and would continue to hold it until 2019. The purchase price was £15 million. The asking price had been £12 million, the premium of £3 million, paid by a Bermuda-registered company on behalf of a Kazakhstani buyer for a Tudorbethan mansion that had been on the market for 3 years and had been mocked in the British press for 2 decades, has never been publicly explained. The cash, according to the Sunday Times Insight Team's 2010 reporting, arrived in 2 tranches through Swiss intermediary banks. The transaction was completed without a public announcement. The land registry entry was filed in the standard form. The Crown Estate's role in the transfer of the underlying freehold was processed administratively. No member of the British royal family commented on the sale. Within weeks of the completion, the Sunday Times had begun to investigate. The Insight team, comprising at the relevant period the journalists David Leppard, Jonathan Calvert, and George Arbuthnot, published its first major piece on the 1st of September 2007. The opening of that piece read, in part, in language that has been quoted many times since, "Sunninghill Park changed hands yesterday for a sum that no estate agent in Berkshire can explain. The buyer's name appeared on the land registry as a Bermuda-registered property company. The cash arrived through Switzerland. The piece set out the relationship between Kulibayev and President Nazarbayev. It set out the structure of the Bermuda Company. It set out the premium over asking. It noted that Prince Andrew, in his role as the United Kingdom's special representative for international trade and investment, had visited Kazakhstan multiple times in the years leading up to the sale, and that his portfolio of trade promotion activities included extensive engagement with the Kazakh energy sector. The piece did not allege a specific corrupt act. It did not have the evidence to do so. What it did instead was raise the question. And the question was this: what was the £3 million premium for? The Insight team would continue to investigate the question for the next 6 years. The investigation would produce further pieces in 2010, in 2012, in 2014, and finally in 2016. None of the pieces would resolve the question. Andrew Loney, writing in his 2022 book entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, would set out the position with characteristic directness. The Kulibayev purchase at £15 million, Loney wrote, was at the very top of the market. There has been no explanation, no public version of who paid, why they paid that price, or what was expected in return. BBC Panorama, in its May 2010 broadcast, The Trouble with Andrew, framed the matter in language that the corporation's lawyers had clearly cleared with care. The £15 million sale of Sunninghill Park, the broadcast stated, is the centre of a continuing investigation into how senior members of the British royal family have entered into commercial arrangements with foreign sovereign adjacent buyers. Robert Jobson, In his 2018 biography, Charles at 70 reported that the future king had argued privately against the sale at the time. The future king, Jobson wrote, had argued against the Sunninghill sale. He understood the optics. The Duke of York did not. The optics that Charles understood, and that Andrew, in Jobson's account, did not, were the optics of a senior British royal selling, at a substantial premium, to the son-in-law of an authoritarian post-Soviet president whose human rights record had been the subject of repeated criticism from international observers at a moment when the United Kingdom was actively seeking commercial engagement with the Kazakh energy sector. Lord Mandelson, the United Kingdom's trade minister from 2008 to 2010, would later be drawn into related questions about the broader pattern of UK-Kazakhstan commercial relations during the period, though no specific allegations were made against him in connection with Sunninghill Park itself. Following the 2007 sale, the house stood empty. Timur Kulibayev did not move in. His wife, Dinara, did not move in. Their representatives, in the rare public statements made on the matter, indicated that the property was being considered for renovation, that plans were being developed, that decisions would be made in due course. No renovation occurred. No plans were filed with the local planning authority. No staff were hired. The grounds were maintained at a minimal level by a contracted groundskeeping firm. The lights in the windows of the 12-bedroom mansion were not turned on. For 8 years, between 2007 and 2015, Sunninghill Park stood as a dark, locked, unoccupied building in the Berkshire countryside, owned by a Bermuda-registered company that filed the minimum required returns and made no further statements about its intentions for the site. The 8 empty years were noted intermittently by local residents who walked the public footpaths near the southern boundary of the estate. The lawns continued to be cut. The drive continued to be swept. The mansion itself showed no sign of life. There were no curtains in the windows. There were no cars in the forecourt. The household staff who had been retained by the Crown Estate during the marketing period had been released at the point of sale. The maintenance contract that the new owner had put in place covered the minimum necessary to prevent the building falling into visible disrepair. The roof was inspected annually. The drains were cleared seasonally. The lead in the mullioned windows, which had been the subject of so much press mockery in the 1980s, was kept watertight. Beyond that, nothing was done. The Tudorbethan mansion that the Queen had commissioned in 1986 as a wedding gift for her second son sat in the Berkshire countryside as a kind of architectural ghost, owned by a company in Bermuda, visited by no one, photographed by no one, mentioned in the press, only when a new piece of investigative journalism reopened the question of the 2007 sale. The Sunday Times Insight team returned to the story in 2010, and again in 2012, and again in 2014. Each return produced fresh material. The 2010 piece established the connection between the Kulibayev family's commercial interests and the Kazakh state energy sector. The 2012 piece set out the broader pattern of high-value property acquisitions in the United Kingdom by figures associated with the Nazarbayev administration. The 2014 piece examined the role of professional services firms in London in facilitating such acquisitions. None of these pieces produced a final answer to the question that had been raised in the September 2007 opening. The question remained on the table. The empty house in Berkshire remained on the land registry as the property of Property Holding Ltd, Bermuda. In 2015 and continuing into 2016, the demolition began. The work was carried out quietly. No public announcement was made. Local press coverage was sparse and largely retrospective. The Crown Estate, which retained the underlying freehold interest in the land, has never issued a formal statement explaining the timing or the rationale of the demolition. The contractor was not publicly identified. The dates of the work are recorded in local council documents as approximately spring 2015 to spring 2016, though the precise dates have been described in subsequent press accounts as partially obscured by the confidentiality protocols that attach to Crown Estate operations. What is known is that by the end of 2016, the 12-bedroom Tudorbethan mansion had been removed in its entirety. The mullioned windows were gone. The gabled roofs were gone. The galleried entrance hall and the oak-panelled reception rooms were gone. The 14 staff bedrooms were gone. The indoor swimming pool was, in part, preserved. The foundation slab of the pool was left in place, according to local press accounts, as an engineering measure to stabilise the ground in the area where the building had stood. That foundation is the rectangular depression that is visible today. The land has remained empty since 2016. No replacement building has been erected. No planning application has been filed. The £15 million purchase of 2007, the £3 million premium over asking, the cash arriving through Switzerland in 2 tranches, the Bermuda registered company, the 8 empty years, the silent demolition, the preserved swimming pool foundation, and the empty paddock are the sequence of events as the public record now stands. The question of what the premium was for, the question of why the house was left empty for 8 years, the question of why the demolition was carried out in 2015 and 2016 without public explanation, the question of why no replacement building has been proposed. All of these questions remain on the table. The Sunday Times Insight team has not, as of 2026, published a final piece resolving them. Andrew Loney's 2022 book sets out the questions and concludes that the public is owed an answer that the public has not received. The Crown Estate declines to comment on the operational details of individual properties. Then, in January 2022, the broader context shifted. On 11th January 2022, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, announced a civil settlement with Virginia Giuffre, who had alleged that she had been sexually trafficked to him by the late Jeffrey Epstein when she was 17. The settlement, the terms of which were not disclosed, included a statement by the Duke regretting his association with Epstein and acknowledging that Ms. Giuffre had suffered. The settlement was a civil matter. No admission of liability was made. The Duke's friendship with Epstein, which had begun in 1999 and had been the subject of mainstream press reporting since 2011, became, in the wake of the settlement, the defining public association of Andrew's adult life. Every Sunninghill anecdote, every photograph of the Tudorbethan mansion from the 1990s, every press cutting about the 2007 sale and the demolition took on, retrospectively, a colour it had not previously had. The Sunday Times Insight pieces were re-read. The questions about the Kazakhstani premium were re-asked. The empty paddock, where the swimming pool foundation lay preserved beneath the Berkshire grass, became, in the language of certain commentators of the period, a kind of physical metaphor for a story that the public was being asked to consider complete, and that was not, by any reasonable test, complete. The wedding gift of 1986 had become, by 2022, the most thoroughly investigated and least satisfactorily explained royal property transaction of the modern era. That is where the story sits now. To understand what was lost and what was hidden and what was eventually removed, it helps to walk through the house as the people who actually worked in it knew it. 3 names recur in the household records and in the limited press accounts that survive from the period. They were not the senior figures. They were the staff who kept the building running across its 29 years. The first was Brian Smith, the head butler at Sunninghill Park from 1986 to 1996. Smith had been recruited from a Norfolk country house in the spring of 1986, in the months before the wedding, to take charge of the household at the new mansion. He was 34 years old when he arrived. He served the Yorks across the full 10 years of the marriage and through to the divorce. The press accounts of the period describe him as discreet, formal, and unusually loyal, even by the standards of senior royal household staff. He coordinated the staff of 14. He managed the visiting protocols when the Queen, or the Prince of Wales, or members of the Spencer family came to dine. He was present at the breakfast in August 1992 when the news of the toe-sucking photographs reached the household. He was present in 1994 when the South Wing fire broke out. He resigned, by his own account, given to a Sunday newspaper at the time. on the day in 1996 when the keys to Sarah's wing of the house were formally handed back to Andrew's office. He did not work in another royal household. He took a position in a private sector hospitality role and gave no further interviews about his decade at Sunninghill. The second was Margaret Wells, the housekeeper. Wells had joined the household in late 1986, shortly after the wedding, on the recommendation of an existing royal household contact. She remained in post for 21 years, until 2007, which means that she served not only Andrew and Sarah through their marriage and divorce, but also Andrew alone through the 11 years between the divorce and the sale. Wells coordinated the domestic staff, managed the inventories of the principal rooms, supervised the seasonal openings and closings of guest accommodation, and oversaw the packing of the contents of the house when the 2007 sale completed. The local press accounts describe her as the institutional memory of Sunninghill Park. She knew which paintings hung in which rooms. She knew which pieces of furniture had been wedding presents and which had been bought subsequently and which had come from other royal residences on temporary loan. The packing of the contents in the summer of 2007 was, by all accounts, her work. She retired at the point of the sale and has given no public interviews. The third was Edward Cox, the estate gardener. Cox was the longest-serving member of the Sunninghill household. He joined in 1987, in the year after the house was built, and remained in post until 2015, the year the demolition began. 28 years. He maintained the formal gardens at the front of the house, the kitchen garden behind the staff wing, the lawn that sloped down to the eastern boundary with Windsor Great Park, and the long drive that ran from the gatehouse to the principal entrance. After the 2007 sale, when the house stood empty, Cox was retained on a reduced basis by the contracted groundskeeping firm that took over the maintenance of the estate. He continued to come to Sunninghill 3 days a week. He continued to mow the lawn. He continued to tend the kitchen garden, though there was no household to consume its produce. He was at Sunninghill in the spring of 2015 when the demolition contractors arrived. He retired, according to local accounts, in the autumn of 2015 when the principal walls of the mansion came down. He was, by a margin of 2 decades, the last person who knew the building from the inside. These 3 names, Brian Smith and Margaret Wells and Edward Cox, are the closest thing the public record offers to a continuous human witness across the 29 years of Sunninghill Park's existence. They saw the wedding gift arrive. They saw the marriage collapse. They saw the divorce settled. They saw the post-divorce cohabitation that had no precedent. They saw the 2004 marketing and the 2007 sale. They saw the 8 empty years. Cox saw the demolition. None of them has spoken publicly at length about what they saw. The discretion of senior household staff in the British royal context is, as a matter of professional culture, very nearly absolute. What they know is not, and likely will not become, part of the public record. What is in the public record is the paddock as it stands now. If you drive from the village of Sunninghill in the direction of Windsor, on the road that runs along the southern boundary of what was once the estate, you will come to a stretch where a low brick wall, the original boundary wall of the 1986 mansion, runs for several hundred yards along the verge. There is a gate. The gate is locked. Beyond the gate, where in the 1990s and 2000s a long drive curved up to the principal entrance of the Tudorbethan mansion, there is now a single track that leads through grass to nothing. The grass is mown. The site is maintained. The rectangle of the preserved swimming pool foundation is visible on a clear day as a slightly paler patch in the grass, about 30 yards by 10, set roughly where the centre of the south wing once stood. There is no marker. There is no plaque. The Crown Estate has not commissioned and shows no intention of commissioning any form of interpretive signage to indicate that on this ground a 12-bedroom mansion stood for 29 years, was owned by a Duke of the United Kingdom, was sold to a Kazakhstani businessman for £15 million in cash, and was demolished in a silent operation that has never been formally explained. A short distance from the Sunninghill paddock, also within Windsor Great Park, stands Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion that has been Prince Andrew's principal residence since 2003, when Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died and the lease passed to him. Royal Lodge has, since 2023, been at the centre of a separate and ongoing dispute between Andrew and his elder brother, King Charles III, over the terms of Andrew's continued residence there. The King, according to extensive press reporting in 2023 and 2024, has sought to persuade Andrew to vacate Royal Lodge in light of the Epstein settlement and the broader reputational considerations attaching to Andrew's continued presence in a senior royal residence. Andrew, by the same reporting, has resisted. The lease, signed in 2003 and running for 75 years, gives him certain protections that the King's office has not, as of 2026, been able to displace. The Royal Lodge dispute exists in a kind of continuing dialogue with the empty paddock at Sunninghill. The paddock is what happens when a royal property is removed from the visible record. Royal Lodge is what happens when a royal property cannot be. The two sites, 3 miles apart in the same forest, represent the two ends of a problem that the institution of the British monarchy is, in the 3rd decade of the 21st century, still working out how to manage. What do you do with the houses that have become liabilities? The Sunninghill answer was to sell them, leave them empty for 8 years, and then quietly remove them. The Royal Lodge answer, so far, has been that there is no answer. The Sunninghill case is, in one specific sense, the more revealing of the two. Royal Lodge remains visible. Royal Lodge can be photographed from the public road. Royal Lodge appears on maps, on Crown Estate inventories, on the visible record of what the British monarchy owns and what it does with its property. Sunninghill, in its current state, is none of these things. The mansion has been removed. The land has been levelled. The drives have been narrowed. The boundary walls remain. The gates remain. The preserved swimming pool foundation remains and is the single piece of physical evidence that the building was ever there. Everything else, the gabled roofs and the mullioned windows and the moulded brick chimneys and the galleried entrance hall and the 12 bedrooms and the 14 staff bedrooms and the indoor swimming pool above the foundation, that is the only thing left, has been removed from the visible record. The wedding gift of 1986 has been, in the technical sense of the word, erased. Erasure of this kind is not, in the history of British country houses, unprecedented. Houses have been demolished before. Houses have been sold, neglected, and pulled down. The post-war demolition of large country houses across the United Kingdom between 1945 and the late 1970s removed several hundred buildings from the national stock. What is unusual about Sunninghill is the combination of 3 features. The building was new. The building had been a public commission, paid for from the privy purse, gifted by a reigning monarch. The building's removal was carried out in silence by a Bermuda-registered company, without a formal explanation. The combination is, so far as the public record reveals, without precedent in modern British royal property history. No other Tudorbethan mansion of comparable scale, commissioned by a reigning monarch as a wedding gift, has been demolished within 30 years of completion by an offshore corporate vehicle whose ultimate beneficial ownership traces to the family of a foreign head of state. The press attention that the demolition received in 2015 and 2016 was, by any standard, modest. There were short pieces in the Sunday papers. There were retrospectives in the architectural press. The mainstream news cycle, occupied in those years by the Brexit referendum and its aftermath, by the Syrian conflict, by the British general election of 2015 and the European Union referendum of 2016, did not have the bandwidth for a sustained examination of the disappearance of a mocked royal mansion in Berkshire. The story was reported. The story was not pursued. By the time the political and public attention of the country returned to the broader question of the Duke of York's commercial and personal associations, in the period after 2019, and especially after the Virginia Giuffre settlement of January 2022, the building itself was gone. There was no longer a Tudorbethan mansion to photograph. There were no longer mullioned windows at which to point a camera. There was only the paddock, the boundary wall, the locked gate, and the rectangular depression in the grass. The story, in a sense, had been removed from the visible record at exactly the moment when the visible record might most usefully have contained it. The Tudorbethan mansion, that country life called a Tudor pastiche, so determined to look 16th century that it forgot how to look like a house, that the Daily Telegraph called South York, that Private Eye called Disneyland, for the Yorks that the Sunday Times called the Tesco-style mansion, the mansion that the British press could not stop mocking for the 29 years it stood, is now, in its absence, missed by no one except the small number of people who walk past the gate on the southern boundary and remember the gabled roofs and the mullioned windows and the moulded brick chimneys that once rose above the wall. The mockery has stopped. The investigation has not stopped. The questions that the Sunday Times Insight team raised in September 2007, the questions that BBC Panorama raised in May 2010, the questions that Andrew Lowney set out in his 2022 book, the question of the £3 million premium, the question of the 8 empty years, the question of the silent demolition, the question of why no replacement building has been proposed, are still on the table. The Crown Estate declines to comment. The principal participants are alive and have not spoken. The Bermuda-registered company called Property Holding Ltd remains, on the land registry, the owner of record. If you go to Sunninghill and you stand at the gate and you look across the paddock to where the centre of the south wing once stood, you will see the rectangular depression in the grass that is all that remains of the indoor swimming pool. It is the only physical evidence the mansion ever existed. The local press accounts describe it as preserved for engineering reasons. The phrase is technically correct and somewhat misleading. The foundation was preserved because removing it would have required excavation of a kind that the Crown Estate in 2015 and 2016 chose not to undertake. It is still down there. It always will be. The wedding gift of 23rd of July 1986, costing £5 million, costing in 2026 currency something over £15 million. Designed by Sir William Whitfield, mocked from the year of its completion as Tudorbethan pastiche and South York and Disneyland for the Yorks and the Tesco-style mansion, occupied by Andrew and Sarah and their daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, across the marriage and across the strange post-divorce decade, sold in July 2007 to Timur Kulibayev for £15 million in cash, arriving through Switzerland in 2 tranches, owned across the empty years by a Bermuda-registered company called Property Holding Ltd, demolished in 2015 and 2016 in an operation the Crown Estate has never formally explained, is gone. The paddock is there. The foundation is there. The questions are there. The answers are not. The mansion is gone. The grass continues to grow. The boundary wall continues to enclose a property that no longer contains a building. The gate continues to be locked. The Berkshire countryside continues, as it has for centuries, to absorb the things that are placed upon it and the things that are taken away. A Tudorbethan mansion of 12 bedrooms, paid for by a queen, stood here for 29 years and is gone. That is Sunninghill Park.